While they might look relatively simple at first, the Splatoon titles are a set of surprisingly complicated and difficult games, with many notable weapons being the face of technical skill expression. In a fast-paced game like Splatoon, the slower weapons tend to be overlooked. However, if you dive a little further into them, those sluggish weapons can be just as flashy and impressive as anything else, and I think one weapon embodies this better than any other. With borderline overpowered attributes that'll force you to play at its pace or get punished for it, today's video is on the TENTA BRELLA. TENT is a fairly overlooked weapon in a now frowned upon weapon class that demands so much skill from its user, but in exchange has an absurd amount of potential that is actively being realized after its 7 years of existence. How has it changed since release? What makes it such a polarizing weapon? And how relevant was it to the metagame over time? All of these questions will be answered, as this is the history of the TENTA BRELLA. I'd like to preface the rest of this video by saying that this is the first weapon I've covered on this channel that I myself do not have much competitive experience with. Because of that, there may be some specifics in this video that either sound a little off or weren't explained super well. If you have questions to ask, think I left something out, or want to point out something that I may have gotten wrong, please leave a comment about it. I'll try to respond the best I can. Additionally, if you're interested in learning TENTA BRELLA for yourself after this video, here are a bunch of channels or links to players that I found extremely helpful to watch videos or VODs of. Their links will all be in the description. With that out of the way, let's get into the video. First of all, what is the TENTA BRELLA? TENT is part of the BRELLA weapon class, a set of weapons introduced in Splatoon 2 which fire pellets somewhat like a shotgun. The more pellets that hit the opponent, the more damage you deal. While this may sound pretty simple on its own, BRELLAs have one staple mechanic that makes them very different from the rest of the game: their shield. When holding the fire button for long enough, BRELLAs can hold out their shield in front of them, which can block enemy attacks and stop projectiles. By holding even longer when using Splat BRELLA or TENTA BRELLA, you can deploy the shield forward, which now allows you to attack while shielding yourself at the cost of a large portion of your ink tank. This deployed shield can provide more angles, block shots, paint, allow for mix-ups, force you and your team in, force the other team to respect you, wall off entire areas, and so on. If you couldn't tell, the BRELLA shield is a very impactful attribute of the BRELLAs, and TENTA BRELLA takes this to the extreme, making it one of the craziest weapons in the game, both conceptually and in practice. Its shield is massive and has 700 health, which can feel borderline unkillable at times. The pellets can also do up to 119 damage, giving it a super threatening one-shot. Combine this one-shot with its launch shield and some good timing, and TENT can force itself forward with little trouble. This makes TENT the most solid weapon at both taking space and controlling areas because of its pure survivability on top of its close-range threat, which also makes it super hard to approach confidently. All of this is crazy, but what really makes TENT so strong is the investment required to take it down. The shield is so strong that fighting it will require multiple people, bombs, and possibly even specials to deal with it, which means that fighting TENT becomes extremely polarizing in many scenarios. TENTA BRELLA's counterplay is essentially a resource management game, requiring the entire team to take it down as quickly as possible without expending too many resources like space and ink. This ability to force your team to think so heavily about counterplay is unlike most other weapons in the game. TENT is a very synergy-focused weapon, and this design extends into its weapon kits as well. Because of its heavy ink usage and heavy weight class, it can't use bombs quite as effectively, so it benefits more from deployable sub-weapons like Squid Beacon and Ink Mine. Specials on TENT, however, have always been most effective when they can help threaten the area around it and keep people away, or give it a strong burst option to be used in tandem with the rest of its tools. As strong as the weapon sounds, there is still plenty of counterplay, and the weapon itself has plenty of weaknesses. TENTA BRELLA is a heavyweight with a relatively slow fire rate, and because it's a BRELLA, the damage can be somewhat inconsistent. This means that you have to have extremely good aim, positioning, and awareness for TENT to be as strong as it can be at the top level, making it one of the most technically demanding weapons in the entire game. The biggest forms of counterplay, however, all have to do with its shield. Because TENT's playstyle is so reliant on its shield, finding ways to shred it, hit around it, or force the user away from it can really weaken the weapon. It tends to struggle against comps with a lot of bombs, weapons like Range Blaster and Rapid which can hit around the shield at a safe distance, and displacement specials like Inkstorm and TENTA Missiles which force TENT to leave its shield, back out, and wait for the shield to regenerate. The easiest counterplay is generally just to attack it from multiple angles, as its slow kill time often ends up getting it killed in 2v1 situations. Those of you who know Splatoon might be wondering why I haven't talked about latency yet. Well, here you go. In short, the BRELLA class is generally weaker than it should be in the North American, European, and Australian Splatoon regions because of the distance between players, and this is a large part of why TENT and BRELLA in general is seen considerably more in Japan. TENT still has some trouble with bugginess and latency, but because the user often launches the shield and goes in with it rather than playing around holding the shield mid-fight and flaring to block shots, it has much less opportunities to get hit through its shield, meaning latency affects it less than the other two BRELLAs. In terms of gear, builds for the weapon at the top level are surprisingly variable. You'll often see the general utility subs as well as small amounts of swim speed up and ink saver main, but the core idea behind a TENTA BRELLA gear build is super different among top players. Most often though, you'll be seeing plenty of quick respawn and stealth jump or object shredder to deal with splash wall, probably the best counter to the tent shield. With the general introduction out of the way, let's get into Splatoon 2. The TENTA BRELLA was not in Splatoon 1 and actually wasn't in Splatoon 2 until sometime after update 1.3. Upon release, TENT didn't see much use for a multitude of reasons. First of all, it was almost immediately written off as an underpowered, slower alternative to the Splat BRELLA, which was really strong at the time. Also in 1.3, Stingray would get its shockwave buff, making it the best special in the game, and giving TENT another reason not to be used. TENT was already pretty underpowered at the time, and one of its biggest counters being used multiple times on essentially every team really did not help its case. Splat BRELLA and Stingray being at the top of the game at the same time really highlighted TENTA BRELLA's weaknesses, and it didn't get much of a chance to show off its strengths for a while. After the next two balance patches though, the potential in this weapon slowly began to reveal itself. In 1.4, TENT got a 16% damage increase and a 2.1% damage cap increase, making one-shots more reliable. However, arguably the biggest change this patch was that shooters, dualies, and splatlings now deal 30% less damage to the BRELLA shield, and seeing as those classes have some of the highest DPS in the game, this was a huge change. 2.0 was really the update that made TENTA BRELLA what it is today, giving it a playstyle more oriented around launching the shield. The time between readying and launching the shield was reduced from 1.5 seconds to only half a second. The amount of ink needed to launch the shield was reduced by 25%, and the time it takes to regain the shield after launching or breaking it was reduced from 9 seconds to 6 seconds. While the amount of time a launched umbrella stays on stage was reduced from 8 seconds to 6 seconds in order to keep the weapon fair, these two updates overall made TENT a much stronger weapon. They honed in on the intended design of the weapon and made the parts of it that were supposed to be strong significantly stronger, which is why some players stopped looking at it in such a negative light. The vanilla TENTA BRELLA comes with Squid Beacon and Bubble Blower, a kit with insane support and synergy potential. While Beacon is incredible for this weapon's game plan, allowing you to create remote super jump spots for your team as well as detect players on the map, the real star player here is, unsurprisingly, Bubble Blower. Bubble Blower is arguably the best special in Splatoon 2 when paired with a lethal bomb, but it's still very strong without it, especially on TENT. Using the special, TENT can launch its shield and essentially create 3 more shields that can turn into a massive explosion whenever the user wants. It can also blow a bubble on top of its BRELLA shield, which essentially makes an explosion-prone, almost invincible TENT shield, which is great for keeping the enemy team even further away from your shield. Bubble Blower makes TENT extremely versatile and applicable on most map modes in Splatoon 2. If you can't tell already, this weapon is pretty insane, but it does have a glaring issue that impacts it more than you'd think. Most Bubble Blower weapons require some sort of investment into Special Power-Up, an ability which increases the size and blast radius of your bubbles. Combining this with Object Shredder makes your bubbles more lethal and easier to pop, but because TENT requires a lot of gear investment, it can struggle to fit any significant amount of Special Power-Up without sacrificing important abilities, like Swim Speed Up, Quick Respawn, etc. While still being very strong and having a lot of supportive capability, the gear dilemma understandably holds this weapon back from what it could be. This TENTA BRELLA wouldn't see much use until later in the game, but it was still theoretically strong in most regions around this time, and was used a fair amount in Japan. The next kit, the TENTA BRELLA, dropped with a somewhat unorthodox kit of Splash Wall and Curling Bomb Launcher. While generally being the least common of the 3 TENTA BRELLAs, this weapon does have its uses. Splash Wall isn't exactly the greatest utility sub for it, especially in Splatoon 2, but the ability to have both a Splash Wall and a tent shield up at the same time is really strong on some map modes against certain teams. On the other hand, Curling Bomb Launcher is one of the best painting specials in the entire game, and Sorella Tent gets it easily at 170p. However, it saw very little use because it requires a lot of team synergy, map dependency, and planning as opposed to other bomb launchers used for a similar purpose. Because it has significantly less use compared to the other TENTA BRELLAs, it was generally seen as the less powerful one, but not by a crazy amount. Sure, it was super uncommon comparatively and never really saw much success, but it is still a TENTA BRELLA, so if a team really wanted to use it, they could've. Overall, Sorella Tent is very team and map dependent, and even then isn't really ever an option that's better to run, making it super uncommon. Still, it's not weak in the slightest, and when planned around properly, can be strong in the few situations where it shines. The last of the Splatoon 2 TENTA BRELLAs is a Sheldon's Pick weapon released in version 4.6. This is the Camo TENTA BRELLA, which comes with Ink Mine and Ultra Stamp, a kit that sounds really cool, and that's because it is. This is probably one of my favorite weapons of all time, and as it turns out, was actually very strong for a while after its release. Ink Mine, just like the other TENTA BRELLA subs, is a utility sub which is honestly great for TENTA BRELLA in a lot of ways. The location effect and trapping abilities are nice, but the damage aspect of Mine is even greater. TENTA BRELLA often does 65 to 80 damage whenever it isn't one-shotting the opponent. and Ink Mine does a minimum of 35, essentially giving it a really weird but feasible combo. 10 is really great at setting up mines as well, and using the shield to push people out of an area can, if placed well, push them into an Ink Mine for an easy kill. Hammer is where this kit really gets crazy though. Combining Ultra Stamp with the shield essentially voids one of the special's biggest weaknesses, its exposure to enemy fire from all angles. Now, you can insta-kill enemies sitting in front of a deployed tent shield by swinging the hammer, and you can combine the repeated stamp with the tent shield to create an invincible wall where the hammer eats bombs and the shield eats shots. In close quarters, it's an insane combo, and having another massive insta-kill threat behind the tent shield, as if one wasn't enough already, is just pretty crazy. Like I mentioned earlier, Camo was a very popular weapon around its release alongside the Vanilla 10. Vanilla was the more supportive kit, offering visibility and jump spots with Beacon, and being able to hold much more space and paint with Bubble Blower. Camo, however, was the equally powerful, more rushdown alternative with its Ink Mine setup combo and a powerful kill option in Ultra Stamp. Both of these weapons were steadily increasing in usage in every region around this time, and they stayed relatively well represented at the top level despite damage, shield, and ink consumption nerfs to come. However, at the end of the game's lifespan, they saw a drop in usage. Why? Well, the meta had shifted to much heavier bomb and special spam, with multiple top weapons being strong against TENTA BRELLA, but one stood out among the rest as the TENTA BRELLA killer, the Kenza 52 gal. K52 was one of the most dominant and powerful weapons in endgame Splatoon 2, alongside other massive threats, and K52's kit is essentially a walking TENTA BRELLA counter. Being one of the most insane main weapons in the game, paired with a splash wall and booyah bomb, made for a painfully obvious pick against Tent. Splash walls insta-kill the Brella shield in most cases, and the only hope Tent has against Booyah Bomb is if it gets significant help from a teammate, or ironically, if it pops Ultra Stamp. Camo Tent specifically matches pretty well into the meta of endgame Splatoon 2. Ultra Stamp is great against Booyah Bomb and Bubble Blower, specials which two top weapons have, and a Brella shield with that much health can be tough to shred for the shooter main weapons at the top of the tier list. Still, bombs are a massive problem, and especially considering that suction bombs do 220 damage in this game, it's definitely fighting an uphill battle. However, it still has the hammer synergy going for it, which makes it by far the strongest Ultra Stamp weapon in the game, and arguably the second strongest Brella weapon overall behind Sorella Brella. Additionally, some notable weapons that pair well with TENTA BRELLA are Carbon Deco, Dually Squelchers, Kenza Rapid, Grim Range Blaster, Charger, Neo Splash, Dynamo, or really anything with TENTA missiles. Throughout Splatoon 2's lifespan, TENTA BRELLA experienced a massive glow up in the eyes of the community at large, going from what many considered to be trash in the early patches to a genuine meta threat at the end. TENTA BRELLA players, while few and far between, have some seriously impressive results that prove the weapon is something to worry about. How will this carry over to Splatoon 3 though? Well, for that, we'll have to find out. The release of Splatoon 3 came with a complete overhaul of the map pool, largely to the dismay of the player base. A lot of these maps were initially bad, with their hallway layouts and frankly boring design. However, hallways are very favorable environments for TENTA BRELLAs, so this would be great, right? Well, as many of you may know, the Brella class quickly became a joke in the Splatoon community because upon release, they all sucked. The latency and desync problems that were already present in Splatoon 2 somehow got worse in Splatoon 3, making the Brella main weapons even worse than before. In combination with their abhorrent kits at the start of the game, this made Brellas easily among the worst weapons in the game for a pretty long time until they received new kits and some buffs. Splatoon 3's vanilla TENTA BRELLA comes with Squid Beacon and Ink Vac, which doesn't sound so bad today, but back then it was horrible. Sure, all the good stuff that comes with Squid Beacon is still in this game, but Ink Vac was the worst special in the game hands down. Vacuum, especially in early Splatoon 3, was really bad in practice for a lot of reasons, but as the game went on and Ink Vac received a number of buffs, it began to rise in usage pretty heavily, and that's when Tent players started thinking about the kit a little more. Ink Vac makes the user extremely vulnerable for a long time, so just like how it was used on Splatoon 2 Camo Tent, launching the Tent Shield in combination with Ink Vac makes for yet another strong combo which lightens a lot of weaknesses of the special. It's a pretty cool use of the special and has its merit, but it didn't see much of a rise in usage on its own. Vacuum has immense trouble in the early metas of Splatoon 3, filled with Crab Tank, Sloshing Machine, TENTA missiles, and so on. Since its buff in Update 4.1, however, Vacuum has drastically increased in usage and has even won a few major tournaments largely because of the shifts in the metagame. But the TENTA BRELLA kit is rarely ever used for Vacuum as opposed to something like Splat Charger. This kit is generally seen as the less applicable TENTA BRELLA, especially in the modern meta, but it's not completely trash like it used to be, and dedicated players have seen success with it. Now though, it's mainly relegated to an alternate pick. Those dedicated players have largely switched over to the second kit, the TENTA Sorella Brella with Ink Mine and Trizuka. Like I mentioned earlier, Ink Mine is one of the best sub-weapons it can have, and Zuka is probably the best special. This kit is extremely reminiscent of Splatoon 2 Camo Tent in the sense that you can safely pop a quick one-shot option from behind the shield. But instead of having Hammer, which was a relatively weak special on its own in Splatoon 2, you now have an insta-kill option which is effective from any range and is one of the best and most applicable specials in the game. It doesn't take much explaining for you to see why this kit is really good, and is generally considered a mid to high tier weapon in the modern game, as well as arguably but not really arguably the best Brella. This weapon has some of the most effective kit synergy in Splatoon 3, and while it still has some trouble against area of effect weapons, bombs, and specials like Crab Tank or Zuka, it's now much more reasonable to run in comps because it has a Zuka of its own, one of the best specials in the game at the moment. As per usual, the weapon has seen success in the hands of dedicated players, which is to be expected. Something that both helps and harms Tent in the modern game is the overwhelming presence of Tacticooler. The speed buffs and max QR are extremely helpful for Tent, but it also has some trouble fighting agile weapons, and Cooler makes them even more agile. Similar to Splatoon 2, some notable weapons that pair well with TENTA BRELLA are Carbon Deco, most Stoolies, Snipe Rider, Rapid Deco, Dynamo, mostly in theory this time, and pretty much anything with Cooler. TENTA BRELLA over the past 7 years has seen multiple stages of relevancy, but right now it has the best chance of succeeding that it has in a long time. However, that chance of succeeding, like I've said before, is in the hands of the top level TENTA BRELLA rep, and unless they give it some absurd kit or buff, it's likely going to stay skill locked for the rest of time. Thanks for watching to the end of this video. I know it's about half as long as they usually are, but that's largely because there's no Splatoon 1 section in this video. It's also my first one after a long break from Splatoon and the community, so I apologize if it's not up to par with the rest of my material. Like I said at the start of the video, leave a comment down below if you have any questions or corrections for me, and if you're interested, go check out videos from the people in my description. Their VODs really help me learn about TENTA BRELLA and the game as a whole, so if you want to learn Tent for yourself, I suggest giving their pages a try. With the Side Order DLC coming out soon, I'll be playing a lot of that over on Twitch, so if you want to interact with me over there, the link to my page is in the description. I also have a community Discord server that I chat in pretty frequently and ping when I go live, and the link to that will also be in the description if you're interested. I hope you enjoyed the video, I hope you can welcome me back to Splatoon, and of course, I'll see you next time.